Hello and welcome. In this video, I'm going to be showing you a very simple approach to creating spline-based roads in your Unreal Engine projects that will conform to your landscape and in fact sculpt your landscape, as well as spawn the appropriate road meshes. We're going to also cover how to create curbs or sidewalks along that road and spawn streetlights along the spline that creates that road as well using a PCG graph. We got a lot to cover, so let's get into it. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this level here, and what we're going to do is switch over to the landscape editing mode. We're going to come up to the drop down and choose landscape. We already have built our landscape. We don't need to do anything else except come here to the manage tab, and under the manage tab you should see a spline option here. Once we've chosen the spline option, we can go ahead into our viewport here and hold down Control and click to create our first spline point. A spline is actually a sequence of points that are connected using tangents, which is a way of just saying we just have points and a curve calculated between those points. So by holding down Control and clicking, we're able to actually add those points to our landscape and it'll snap directly to the surface. So I'll hold down Control and click again over here, and we can see we've started to make this curved road shape. And right now it's going directly through our landscape, but don't worry, we can always adjust that later. So this is good for now. I can always come in here and edit the shape of this road a little bit by selecting one of these points and moving it around. Like this point, I can raise it up a little bit. What I can also do actually is come over here to the spline tool on the left side. We have this option here that says deform landscape to splines. This will adjust the shape of the landscape directly to the spline that we've drawn with this tool, or all the splines that we've added to our landscape. Just to be safe, we may have other splines in our level somewhere. Just go ahead and use the select all option to select all the segments that we have as part of just this spline, and then go ahead and choose only selected here, and this will morph our landscape to the spline that we have selected. Fixes a lot of our intersection problems. And we can go and additionally make changes like raise the road up here and go ahead and do that again. Select your segments and then deform only to this spline, and we can see it actually sculpts this landscape around our splines. So this is great. Now we just need to make some meshes to spawn along this curve so that it actually has a road mesh, because we don't want to do this in a material. In this case, it makes more sense to actually spawn mesh along the curve that will represent the actual road. What we can do is use the modeling tools that are built into Unreal Engine to create our own piece of geometry to extrude along this spline. I'm going to switch over to the modeling tools now, and if you don't see this modeling tools as an option, you just need to enable it as a plugin. So I'll come to the edit drop down, come to plugins and type in modeling, and this is the option that we want to make sure is enabled, modeling tools editor mode. Go ahead and check that on and restart the engine if you have to, but I'm going to switch over to the modeling tools when I have it, and we can see that the curve still exists in our level. We just haven't made any meshes for it. Just leave it how it is for now. What we do want to come over here and do is come to the create button so we can create a new mesh and choose the box option, and I'll just go ahead and click somewhere in the level to add it. That's roughly where our road is. If you don't see these settings, I'll go ahead and zero these out so they're starting from what you'll see in your level, but what I'm seeing here is a width of 100, which I want to increase because I want this to be a bit wider, and a depth 100, which I also want to increase, and I don't need the height to be quite as high for this road, so I can go ahead and lower it. And these are all the settings that will be applied to our mesh when we actually go ahead and hit the accept button here, which will go ahead and create that mesh in our level and in our content browser. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that it has some depth to it, some width to it. So now I also want to make sure that I have enough subdivisions. This is really important. This is the reason we're creating a new mesh for ourselves, because when it uses a mesh and spawns it along the spline's curve, it needs some subdivisions, which are basically how often the mesh is separated and how much geometry is used to create the shape. And so when we curve that along the mesh, we want to make sure we have enough geometry to support that. Otherwise, when it curves, it'll just kind of look jaggedy or just straight, even if it doesn't have any subdivisions. So we want to have enough subdivisions so that when it curves, it has a nice smooth shape to the mesh. So we can go ahead in the width and depth here and maybe add 30. Might be overkill, but you can try out some different options for you depending on how bendy your road needs to be. And for the height subdivision, we don't need that much, but I'll just go ahead ahead and add 3 in to be safe. So we've divided it 3 times in height and 30 times in width and depth, which again might be overkill, but you need to test it and see how much you can get away with, because we do want the shape of the road to still be smooth in these curving areas. Once I have that set up and I'm happy with it, I'm going to actually go ahead and add a material to this mesh. We can go and download a road material straight from Megascans that we can use here. I'll just come over here to the plus button and go to the Quickshell Bridge library, and we'll type in road. A quick and easy way to get to the road materials that have dashes on them, lines on them, is just to type in road and then American, and that is what they've decided to name this particular road material that we can use. So I'll go ahead and choose this one and go ahead and download it, which I've already done, and add it to my project. So now this material, what we can do is go ahead and drag it onto this mesh, and we can see this looks pretty good. And so this is the segment that's going to be spawned along our curve. We can also add this material later, but it just saves a step to add it at the creation process. So now when the mesh is created in our content browser as an asset, it will have the material applied. We can go ahead and hit accept now, and this mesh has been added to our content browser, not just our level, which is something cool about the modeling tool. So I'm going to close the modeling tools for a section by switching to the selection option. And the place you will find the mesh you've just created is under the folder that has your level. You'll see a generated button. In that generated folder, you'll probably see your name or whatever username you've used to log in. And there you will find all the custom meshes that you've made as part of your project. And we can see here that this new road mesh here has been added here. And if we haven't added the material, we can just go ahead and double click on that mesh to open it and add the material in the slot up here. So now we have this mesh. We can go ahead and switch back to our landscape. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and delete this one in our level before we switch, because it will not be able to select it and delete it after we switch over to the landscape mode. So I'll go ahead and hit delete because we don't actually need it in our level anymore. And I'll come over here to the landscape options and switch back to it. And we're snapped back to our spline editing mode here. What I want to do is go ahead and select all segments again. And the reason we want to select all segments is because each segment and point, which is what these are called. So these are called points, and these segments are the surfaces or curve that's attached in between those points. Each of these could technically have their own separate mesh. We want to select all of them so that we can add the road mesh to all of them and not just one. So now that we have all the segments selected, we can come over here on the right side and scroll down in the details panel till we come to landscape spline meshes. And we can hit the little plus button here to show a new input for meshes. So index 0 here, and we can expand that. And this is where we're going to add our road mesh. And this is our road mesh that we just made, and we're going to drag it in to that input. Okay, so this is what we're going to see probably by default. Yours might line up correctly with the spline, but more often than not, it's actually kind of pointing in the wrong direction. So that's easily fixed here in the mesh settings by coming here to the forwards axis. This is kind of the axis that the mesh thinks is forwards. So if it's X, it's going to point this way. If we switch it to Y, it's going to switch 90 degrees. So we can drop that down and switch it to Y, and we can see that it switches our road 90 degrees. So now our road is looking much better. We can also adjust it in positioning slightly. If we want to push it down into the ground a little bit, we can come over here to the center adjust is going to push the road up or down. It's the second number that goes up and down. So we want to go and type in negative because we want to push it down. Type in negative 10. And that pushed it down a little bit, but not enough. Let's try negative 30. All right, there we go. Now it has been pushed down into the ground for us, and that looks a lot more natural. Another thing we probably want to do is that our mesh is being stretched out to the full width of the segments that are spawned in between the spline points. But we can always switch that off by coming to the scale by width here, checking that off, and that will collapse it back down and not stretch the texture quite as much, because we made a square tile, so we don't actually need to stretch it even further out. So that's the basics of spline road creation. Now we want to probably think in some cases about adding a mesh along the side of it. For example, a curb or a sidewalk, depending if you're inside a city where there's walkable areas. That is something that is a little more tricky to add here because this spline is not easy to duplicate and move to the side. What we can do is go ahead and create a new spline actor along the side here. So we can come back to our spline tool, make sure it's selected, and come over here and hold Control. And so long as we're far enough away from the point so that it knows it's not the same spline, we can go ahead and make a new spline. And we want to make sure that this existing spline is not selected. So sometimes I like to switch onto another tool here and back, and then I can come over and hold down Control and make a new spline point. Otherwise, sometimes it thinks it's part of the same spline and will loop it back around. Let's go ahead and draw some splines along the edge here. And what you're going to want to do is just copy the exact same position of those spline points. And then you can go ahead and create a new curve that follows it exactly. And then we can go ahead and do the exact same process. Come over here on this spline and select these segments, maybe shift selecting them, and coming over here to the place where it has spline meshes, hitting the plus button and expanding the index. And here we can go ahead and add a curb, which I've actually downloaded from Megascans, one of the curb options. So I can go ahead and drag this in here. And then we're going to do the same process. We're going to change the width back down here, and then we'll probably need to go in and adjust these positions so that they match the road a little bit better. The issue is that the more crazy the shape of the road, the more difficult it is to line it up. Hypothetically, it should line up correctly if all of the points are in the same place, but sometimes it doesn't. And so this can be a little bit of a frustrating way to approach your roads. It gives you some flexibility because you can just have some parts of the road have curbs to it and then kind of more creatively adjust the placement of the curb and how it moves over the surface. But for me, what I found is that there's a way to approach this that usually works a little bit better for me, and that is to combine the curb mesh with the actual road mesh, make it one piece, and just have that spawn along the one curb. So let's go ahead and set that up. So I'm going to go ahead, come back here, and I'm going to go ahead and delete these points and segments. So now we're back to just one curve. And this mesh here, I'm going to go ahead and select it and come over to my inputted meshes here. Go ahead and hit this little button here to show me where it is in my content browser. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this. So there's a new mesh, and I'm going to drag it into the level. And we're going to switch over to the modeling tools again. So I'm going to drag this up here out of the way so we can work on it. And I'm going to go back to my place where I had my curb and drag that in as well. And this one, I'm just going to position by hand. I'm going to turn on snapping so I can just rotate it 90 degrees. And we'll go ahead and just position it by hand exactly where I want the curb to be. I'm going to increase the size a little bit as well. And the goal here is that you want the end of the curb to line up exactly with the end of the road so that there is no seams when you're spawning it. Thankfully, the curb has a nice pivot point at the beginning here, so I can scale it up like this. There we go. Okay, so I have this curb, and I'm going to duplicate it over to the other side here. And we could, have a few curbs. It's up to you how you want to do it, but let's go ahead and shift select all three of them, and we're going to come over to the modeling tools here on the left side and come over to the mesh option. And what we want to do is choose union. This is going to combine both of them into the same mesh. It may take a few moments, especially if some of your meshes are Megascans meshes. We could go ahead and model the curb ourselves using the modeling tools the same way we did the road, but I like the way that the Megascans meshes look, so I'm going to go ahead and use those. You'll probably get this loading visualization over the top of the mesh, which just means that it's calculating. So you just sort of have to wait it out until it finishes. And again, if these nanite meshes are too much for your computer to combine using these mesh tools, you'll probably just need to model or use a simpler mesh for the curb. When it's done, it should show up like this as a finished mesh, and we'll go ahead and add a name for it, which will be road sidewalk, and we'll go ahead and hit accept. This will make a new mesh with the road mesh and the curb or sidewalk mesh combined all together. And we can find this mesh that's been created again under the maps folder where we have our level or wherever you've saved your level under the generated folder under your name, and you should see it here. I have my road sidewalk mesh created. So again, we'll go ahead and delete this, and we'll come back over to our landscape options here, and under the spline section, we'll go ahead and select all segments here, and we'll drag our new mesh onto the mesh input. And there we go. Now we have a new road with the new sidewalks and everything combined. I will mention also that if you are using nanite meshes in your levels, this new mesh that we actually made with one mesh that's nanite, one that's not, by default, all our new meshes aren't nanite. So we'll need to come in here and right click and go ahead and switch it to nanite if we're using the nanite workflow. Just wanted to mention that because I used the nanite mesh as a starting point, so it was very dense. So I'm going to start running into issues instantly with my frame rate if I don't go ahead and switch that super dense mesh back to nanite after creating it. All right, let's go ahead and adjust our landscape again to our curves in case anything's changed. So I'll go back to the deform landscape to splines option and choose only selected. And also, I think I'm noticing that since we make a new mesh for the road and the curbs, it is a slightly lower. Its its pivot is a little bit off, so now it's below the surface. So we just need to remember to come back here and adjust the center adjust option here, and I guess it'll be maybe -10 might work better. There you go. Maybe even none, maybe even no adjustment. So it's right on the surface there. That looks good. So now we have a road with a sidewalk working great. So that's how you make a road and a sidewalk. This is the best way I found to combine the both of them and have them both smoothly adjust with the curves in your landscape. But what if you want to spawn things around the curve, like street lamps along the side, or benches, or piles of trash, whatever it is? This is how you'd go ahead and make sure that your PCG graphs can pick this up and add in those additional meshes. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the selection mode, come back to the PCG folder. I'm going to right click and make a new PCG graph, and under PCG, choose PCG graph and type in PCG underscore road meshes, or whatever you'd like to call it. If you don't see PCG as an option, it means you just need to enable it as a plugin. So come up to edit and plugins and choose PCG here, and make sure you have this one, procedural content generation framework, enabled. Okay, I'm going to close that, and let's go ahead and drag our PCG graph into the level. Let's double click on it to open it. Okay, so the first node that we want to make is a get spline data node, which is going to go and find the splines in our level. So I'll go ahead and say get spline data node. So this node, normally we would just come here and choose all world actors and then find a tag. But this is not going to work for us in this case because the curve is actually contained within the landscape itself. If we're using world partitions as an option in our levels, the curve will show up in your outliner and you can go ahead and add a tag to it. But if world partition is not enabled, or you're not using that workflow, we don't necessarily have that. So the best way to get at that curve in your landscape is to come over under actor section and switch it to by class. And then we'll come over here to actor section class and drop down and type in landscape and choose this landscape option. This is going to look for all the curves on your landscape, and it's going to pick up the one that we chose to use for our road. Next, we want to go ahead and grab a spline sampler. And this one we want to choose under the mode, we want to choose distance. So we go ahead and come to the spline sampler and hit D. We can start to see the points being sampled in the area where our graph volume is. If we want to expand the graph and get more points on the curve, we can always use the scaling options to increase the size of the PCG volume, and then we'll just have to make sure we go ahead and hit this force regen option in the graph for it to spawn the points again. Or we can go ahead and come to the spline sampler, and if we type in unbound, we can go ahead and make it unbound and force regenerate, which will then again all the points regardless of how big the volume is itself. Okay, so now we have these points coming out from the landscape spline. So we can drag off of this spline sampler now and create a transform points node. And we're going to drag off of that, and we're going to go ahead and create a mesh static mesh spawner, and we'll go ahead under the mesh entries section and hit the plus button, and I'm going to go ahead and add my street lamp mesh. One problem is that it's getting weirdly shaped by the points themselves. They're kind of all squished. So we're going to have to come over to the transform points here and come to the absolute scale option and check that on. That's going to make the absolute scale 1 by 1 here instead of the weird shape that the point is, and that will let us keep our street lamps the right size. Now we can come over to our spline sampler here and mess with the distance increment. Distance increment is going to be the spacing of the points. So if I increase this up to 300, we're going to get a lot fewer points. And then if we increase this maybe to 500, that's even better. Let's increase it maybe to 800, maybe even 1,000. There we go. That starts to look like a little bit better spacing for the street lamps. Now we just need to offset them to the right. So we'll come back to that transform points and we'll come to the offset min and max here, and we'll go ahead and offset them by in the X or Y direction. So let's try the X direction. That's wrong too, so it must be the Y direction. And we want to actually push it in the negative direction. So we'll make it negative and then 800, not quite enough, maybe 1,200, maybe 1,500. There we go. So you'll see they actually have a random spacing. We have to make sure, this is something I sometimes forget, we have to make sure we put the same number in both the min and max values, and that will be the true number that's used by all of them. So now I have to go ahead and adjust it because that was too much. So let's try 1,000 and 1,000, and maybe it is in fact 800 by 800 is the correct distance here, maybe 9. Okay, that looks pretty good. And we'll stop debugging our spline sampler here by hitting D. Okay, so now that we have all the street lamps on one side, all we have to do is flip that logic to create the other side. So we can go ahead and just take these points, these transform point node, copy and paste it over here. And the settings here will be mostly the same, except instead of moving them in the negative Y direction, we're going to move them in the positive Y direction. We are going to rotate them here around the Y or the Z axes. So we'll go ahead and make 180 in the Z rotation min and max, which will take all the lamps and rotate them around so they're facing the opposite direction. And then we'll go ahead and plug that directly into our other static mesh spawner. So we're taking 2 copies of the same points and doing 2 different translations to them. One to move it to one side and the other to move it to the other side, and then rotate them back around so they're both facing the same direction. And there you have it. That is how to create a road and street lights. You could go really crazy with this because you have both the PCG points and the actual meshes spawning along the landscape curve, so you can spawn all kinds of stuff and you just need to plug it into the correct place. Depending on whether it's a collection of meshes, you would use it in the PCG graph to spawn them, or if it's actually something that you want to morph with the road, you'd go ahead and combine it with the road mesh plate that's being duplicated here. All right, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, shoot me a thumbs up or a comment if you have any questions or you'd like to see other approaches or how to take this and expand it in other areas. If you're enjoying the tutorials and you're wanting to work a little more closely with me and get more personalized support, for example, you're tired of shifting through all the YouTube videos and you want a more structured and personalized learning path, you can join something that I have called Aziel Arts Academy, which is a blend of courses and personalized tutorials, coaching, and an exclusive community where you can get all your questions answered. If you're interested in that, you can find a link in the description below this video. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one.